House fires are among the most stressful and disorienting experiences a person can face. Well, what happens when the person caught in that crisis is a brain injury survivor? Someone whose brain processes danger, priorities, and survival in a completely different way. I'm Kyle Como, legal nurse consultant here at Shane Smith Law, and this is Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions, where we explore traumatic brain injury from every angle, whether it's medical, legal, or lived experience. Today, we're welcoming back our friend Jayme Severance, who joined us before to share his story of traumatic brain injury and long-term recovery. Since that conversation, Jayme has faced yet another life-changing event, a house fire that put his brain injury, his instincts, and his ability to respond under pressure into sharp focus. In this episode, we're going to hear how he made out, what went through his mind in the moment, and how TBI can shape responses in ways that most people would never expect. Jayme, it's good to see you again, man.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So let's get right into it, Jayme. What happened? Tell us.
All right. So, allow me to preface my remarks with the fact that I have much to say because there are a lot of moving parts to the story. So I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking, but your viewers and listeners can observe my behavior in the following account and draw their own conclusions from it. Also, before I begin, I should tell you I sustained what's known clinically as a diffuse axonal injury, grade 3. This was in 2006 when I was a senior in high school, coming back from paintballing with my brother. I was T-boned by a pickup truck, which ultimately contributed to me sounding like this. To compensate for the speaking and memory issues that followed, I'll be aided by my notes for this interview because what I'm about to tell you may be upsetting. Trigger warning. And I want to capture every detail accurately, so if it looks like I'm reading from something, that's why. I would be using more professional looking audio equipment and be dressed more appropriately for the speaking engagement if it weren't for a 3-alarm apartment fire that ruined my suit, along with making my apartment unlivable. I lost everything. I even had to fetch these from the wreckage myself. They're all duct taped together. It looks bad, but they work. I'm scrappy like that. But now, the night of fire, I was brushing my teeth when the fire alarm went off. At first, I didn't think much of it, but because my smoke detector went off constantly for random reasons. But then, someone started pounding at my door, and it was my neighbor yelling for everyone to get out of the building because it was on fire. You can even see what the fire looked like if you Google Jayme Severance, Jayme Lewis Severance, or Beach Hell Fire. That's Beach, B-E-E-C-H, Hell Fire. I believe I sent you some pictures I took of the blaze. I even managed to take a video of the back of the apartment while firefighters were mostly working the front. And that video is indexed by Google via my knowledge panel. Now, with that said, it's worth noting my mother lives with me. This is because she has severe osteoarthritis and mobility issues, so my first priority in the fire was getting her out safely. I grabbed her walker and escorted her outside. We live right next to the entrance, so thankfully we were able to get out quickly. Then my mother yelled at me to get the cat, and the cat was only a year old, so she didn't know she was in danger. I got my mom out and then did a quick 180, blowing past firefighters to re-enter a burning building. Once inside my apartment, I quickly scanned for my cat. She wasn't in the living room or at the dining area like she'd normally be. At this point, I was getting worried as I continued my search. Not in the kitchen, not in the bathroom, it wasn't in my room. Mind you, there was a little voice in the back of my mind telling me to hurry, over and over and over again. Hurry, hurry, hurry. I checked my room. Cat wasn't in there. I thought that maybe she was hiding, and I really didn't have time to look. Hurry. I found her in my mom's room, right next to her oxygen tank. The last time I checked, oxygen and fire go boom. My eyes widened as I scooped her up and put her in the carrier. Before I left with her, though, I gave into my impulses and did one last scan of the place. I didn't sense immediate danger, despite my whole building being outside and a few fire trucks being outside. Their sirens were painting the inside of my apartment red. This is when I noticed my bedroom window was open. Yikes. My thinking was that if the fire didn't turn out to be that bad, I didn't want fire hoses to soak my room. Mind you, at this point, I didn't even see the fire. I just knew there was one close by because it was getting hotter by the minute. This was when everybody outside looking in were horrified to see me shut my bedroom window. It was foolish, it was impulsive, and it was reckless. The irony is that I risked my life trying to prevent water damage, right? Only for the apartment to suffer catastrophic water damage anyway. For context, in a 3-alarm fire, that's multiple hoses spraying up to 500 gallons of water per minute. This is industrial grade water damage. So, not closing a window was a tragically hilarious mismatch fixed cool problem that far exceeded the scale of its solution. That's like me trying to put the fire on myself with a water gun. It just doesn't work. But the thought to mitigate potential damage is important because it shows where my brain was at during the crisis. I wasn't thinking, this apartment is destroyed. Instead, I was acting as if I might come back. But at the same time, every extra second I spent shutting windows or grabbing work equipment, it all exponentially increased my exposure to smoke inhalation, while firefighters outside my window were literally screaming at me to get the hell out of Dodge. Here is where my TBI really showed itself though, because most people might think, you're alive, your mother is alive, your cat is alive, everything else can be replaced, right? But my thought process was, I need to be able to make money. See, I'm a copywriter at a marketing agency, and because I work remotely, my brain immediately jumped to continuity. I thought, how was I going to be able to keep life moving after this? So, after I got my cat and scanned the area, I hastily grabbed a bag and threw in my MacBook, my phone, and both chargers to it. You know, honestly, this feels like a critique of capitalism because in a moment when more than a few people would normally be focused on survival, my brain was focused on productivity and making sure I could still work the next day. My employer can vouch for that too. When I told them what happened, they told me not to worry about it right now. But yeah, this is what happened.
Jayme, thanks for walking us through that. It really gives, I think, our audience a kind of a clear sense of how suddenly everything shifted and how much was happening in that moment. I think it also helps set up the way your brain was responding under pressure, which is an important part of the conversation. So let's continue this arc. What started the fire?
All right. So officially, it's unknown at this point, but we do know how the fire spread. It scaled the building rapidly because it reached the attic space very early. According to fire officials, the apartment complex, it had a large unprotected attic area with limited fire barriers. This means it didn't have a sprinkler system. The apartments were constructed in the 70s, before buildings were required to have them. And once flames hit the roof, it was a done deal. Signed, sealed, and delivered. The Inferno was able to quickly move across the structure. It literally ziplined from apartment building to apartment building within minutes. My mother told me the fire traveled as quickly as lit gasoline once it hit the roof. Firefighters arrived swiftly, I think in 4 minutes, and they traced the fire to a top floor apartment. I lived directly below it on the first floor. But the combination of the unprotected attic space and a nearby broken fire hydrant to boot, it created major challenges for first responders. The incident escalated into a 3-alarm fire involving around 100 firefighters. This made trying to move around to find the Red Cross hectic. In fact, the emergency response itself created a practical problem. Fire apparatus, vehicles, and crews effectively blocked the most direct way to the Red Cross meeting area. To get around them, I had to run several apartment buildings down before I could slip through because they weren't letting anybody pass. Now, normally, this would have been an inconvenience, but my mother had severe mobility limitations, as I said. She wasn't able to make that trip on her own. So, while trying to be there when the Red Cross arrived, I was also constantly going back and forth to check on her. First responders were so busy dealing with the fire itself that they simply didn't have the people available to help her relocate. For a while, I found myself struggling between two competing priorities: following instructions from first responders and making sure my mother was okay. Because in addition to having mobility problems, she also had breathing issues, and she frequently needs to be seated to catch her breath. Although there were seats on her walker and the Red Cross meeting area, if she can't recline, her legs swell up, causing extreme pain. And when I say extreme pain, I'm talking to the point where before we found a med that worked for her years back, she tweeted with me to kill her outright, to seriously end her life. This is not an exaggeration. The pain really was that bad. On top of that, we had evacuated without those pain meds. Later, the Red Cross informed us that meds exposed to extreme heat from the fire could no longer be considered safe to take. Bigger problem. This meant that when we later discovered that the meds survived, it was pointless information by that time. So, in addition to finding somewhere for my mother to sit, I also found myself worrying about how we were going to be able to replace the medication she depended on every day. This added to the urgency of an already chaotic situation. Between the darkness, the water, the emergency vehicles, the firefighters, my non-stop movement, and my mother's needs, it felt like running an obstacle course while a major disaster was still unfolding. And as I went back and forth between my mother and the Red Cross meeting area to see if they arrived yet, she was watching all we worked for go up in flames, alone, by herself, in pain, without me there to comfort her. She eventually told me to stop checking on her and to leave her behind, because getting in touch with the Red Cross was more important. I couldn't achieve that if I was absent from the meeting area, just because I wanted to check on her. In the end, though, I found a few crew members to help. Even with how quickly the fire spread, crews successfully evacuated residents, and it prevented anybody from dying. The building itself was considered destroyed from the fire damage, the smoke damage, and the water damage, according to standards set by FEMA. The news called the affected buildings a total loss. After the fire, and initial investigation, when the property allowed us to sift through the apartment for valuables, I had to wear an N95 mask and a hard hat because it was so difficult to breathe inside the unstable, charred structure. The inside was so wet, I could have literally, and the carpet was drenched, I could have literally knocked down the drywall, literally with my bare hand. It was like clay. Dozens of us residents were displaced, including my mom and me. Now, the exact cause of the fire is still under investigation, and in fires like this, especially in large, multiple unit apartment buildings, determining the cause can take years, and sometimes evidence is compromised so quickly by weather conditions and mold that investigators, they're never able to determine an exact cause at all.
Wow, Jimmy, that added a lot of, I think, important context, especially around how quickly things escalated and kind of set the mental scene for the audience. Again, to put it in proper context, it's one thing to hear there was a fire, but it's another thing to understand that the scale of what you and everyone else were dealing with, right? That background really helps appreciate how intense that must have been. What role did your TBI, in our first episodes, again, audience, go back and check out Jayme's interview we did in times past. That really, I think, give you some more context into how Jayme's brain processes things. So what role did your TBI play in response to the fire?
All right, so that's actually a really interesting question. And because my TBI affects my ability to respond quickly, my first instinct during the fire wasn't survival, it was continuity, to create structure for myself. And in the neuropsychological evaluations I've taken, they all show the same thing. I need structure. After the fire, when the property's maintenance supervisor was surveying the damage, he asked if there was anything important he could retrieve for me from the building before the investigation began. Immediately, I told him my fireproof document box. I happen to have one. Incidentally, at the time, I didn't even know that the Red Cross would later require identification or government documents in order to provide services. They basically acted as the structure for our recovery. And what's fascinating is that this decision to save the government document box turned out to have practical value, even though I wasn't consciously thinking about disaster recovery at that time. At this point, I had no idea what paperwork would be needed, what organization would become involved, and what documentation would later be requested. And yet, as the recovery process played out, these things became incredibly important. The Red Cross assigned us an event number and a case number. This meant identity documents mattered, proof of residence mattered, and verification letters mattered. In other words, my instinct to preserve official documents turned out to be useful, even though I wasn't consciously thinking about, I'll need this for Red Cross recovery services at this time. I was simply trying to preserve continuity and structure by maintaining it in my life. Looking back, it's weird that my priorities were things like work equipment and official documents instead of emotional processing or shock. For example, when the Red Cross was doing its intake processes with survivors of the fire at 1 to 2 in the morning, my neighbor was sitting on the ground, knees held to their chest, weeping, swaddled in a Red Cross blanket. They, like me, lost everything. Survivors were left nothing, many survivors were left with nothing. Many survivors left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I didn't know how to feel at this moment, so I was mostly emotionless. I didn't know what to do, so I paced. I had the bright idea then. I had to create a GoFundMe while I was at the Red Cross recovery spot with the pictures and video I had just taken of the fire. Aha! I figured I might as well if I couldn't feel anything, I might as well do something while I was doing nothing and cope through action. My response is one of the difficult realities of TBI. It can absolutely affect how survivors prioritize and process things in a crisis.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That's such a telling example of how traumatic brain injury can really shape the way someone responds in a crisis. What stood out to me is how your brain was trying to hold on to that. Again, you said it, a continuity, that stability, even in the middle of chaos. I think it says a lot about the practical and the psychological effects of a traumatic brain injury. You've described in previous episodes some of your symptoms, if you will, the way your brain responded to your TBI. I think at that time you called them helpfully inappropriate, I think was the term. What did you mean by that, and how'd that play in here?
In some ways, my TBI likely influenced my inappropriate crisis response. But that was maladaptive, though that may be. It was strangely functional at the same time. See, one of the side effects of my brain damage is disinhibition, which involves a reduced sense of social restraint and sometimes impulsive behavior in social and high-stakes situations. And wildfires in of themselves aren't inherently social. There is a social component to firefighting. Firefighters show up, you listen. Disinhibition is the last thing you want in a crisis. It would be almost mandatory to get your disabled mother out of a burning building and stay with her. And to be fair, I did get her out, but then, as I mentioned before, I went back inside for my cat, my phone, my computer, and related charges. Beyond my cat, I wasn't even sure if saving these things would be worth it in the first place, or if they would later become liabilities later on, given that the fire would make everyone homeless. But later on, given that the fire would make everyone homeless, when firefighters and first responders outside my window screamed at me to get the hell out of my apartment, one of my neighbors actually told rescuers I was deaf. And the interesting thing is that this person also has TBI, yet even they couldn't understand what was happening inside my head. And to those watching me that night, I'd have to be deaf, right? I wasn't obeying verbal commands during a crisis. Either I was crazy or something was off. Obviously, something had to explain my behavior. Now, my neighbor that night knew I wasn't actually deaf. At least, I think so. But from the outside, crews saw firefighters yelling, a building on fire, and I'm still moving around inside, shutting windows and gathering things. They knew something was different. They just couldn't see the TBI. And so, a narrative had to be created to explain my behavior. In fact, I recently listened to some of the firefighter radio traffic from that night, which is public information. And through that radio chatter, firefighters reported that I had gone back inside, saying that I was attempting to rescue pets. Attempting. Attempting is an interesting word choice because it implies I might not have been successful. That survival wasn't an absolute, and they were wrong. I had gone back for my cat. The ceiling could have collapsed, and there wasn't a guarantee that I'd even find my cat as quickly as I did. But firefighters couldn't see everything else that was happening in my head. Continuity, work, document, structure. Hurry. They were privy to the split-second decisions being filtered through a severe TBI. And that's one of the challenges of an invisible disability. People often observe the effects before they understand the cause. To be fair, some survivors even had to be dragged out of their apartment while the fire was still burning because they weren't leaving, and these people didn't have TBI. At least I don't think so. To be fair, some survivors even had to be dragged out of their apartments while the fire was still burning because they weren't leaving, according to the property's maintenance supervisor. As I said, the fire alarms went off frequently, and given that the general population of the apartment complex tends to be in old age, it's unclear if they wouldn't leave, couldn't leave, or just thought it was a false alarm. But anyway, by going back inside, I potentially put first responders at greater risk because they now had to account for someone who re-entered a flaming structure. And the kicker is, what I got was all replaceable. Not my cat, obviously. Overall, I don't regret my response. Not for 1 second. And because I work remotely, preserving access to my work via my MacBook allowed me to maintain financial continuity almost immediately after the disaster, along with the generosity of donations from friends, family, and strangers alike. It helped pay for a hotel for me, my mother, and my cat following the fire when the Red Cross funding dried up. I think they gave us around $650 that night, but even with the hotel and the means to pay for it, it still didn't mean we were out of the woods. For example, although we were away from the fire, the cat was safe, and the hotel had an all-you-can-eat breakfast. My mom was still short of her pain medication. Before our family could get us replacement meds, I distinctly remember being woken up by the sound of her weeping late at night when I was trying to sleep because her legs hurt that bad. This destroyed me. I felt so helpless. But in the end, we reasoned that it was better to stay at the hotel and tough it out until we could get refills on her prescription. That way, I could still work, and the pharmacy itself turned out to be half a mile away from the hotel anyway, for me retaining some sense of consistency by being able to remain at the hotel until we could get an apartment was psychologically grounding, even if the way my mother and I pursued that stability and continuity looked irrational to everyone else. In closing, my observations demonstrate how one high-functioning severe TBI survivor reacted in a crisis situation, and that's critical information since most of the literature on disinhibition talks about it in controlled clinical settings without much real-world application. What's interesting is that the idea for this discussion actually came to me while I was still homeless from the fire, and I reached out to this podcast while I didn't have a fixed place to stay. I chose priority, and even then, I found myself wondering whether what I had just experienced could help people better understand how a severe TBI might affect decision-making during a crisis. After all, I had just lived through a real-world stress test where firefighters were yelling at me to get out, and my apartment was burning above my head, and I was still worrying about things like continuity, work, document, structure, and I suppose that's why we're having this conversation today. Because if my experience could help clinicians, attorneys, first responders, caregivers, and other survivors better understand how one brain injury affected decision making during a crisis, then at least some good came from this fire. I think that's an encouraging thought.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Jayme. We appreciate you. Yeah, this is definitely a unique conversation. If you're a first timer to our show, it's unique in that, as Jayme said, we're diving into someone's. I say it in the intro. We explore TBI from every angle, medical, legal, and that last one being that lived experience. And this is just a raw and honest look into a real life kind of play-by-play, very stressful lived experience that Jayme's just shared with us. And we appreciate that, Jayme. To our audience, this experience, Jayme's experience, is a powerful, really, exploration into how traumatic brain injury can shape the way it does shape a way a person responds when crisis hits without warning, as they often do. I'd like to ask those in the audience if Jayme's story hit home with you, if you've been through a similar situation. We would love to hear from you in the comments. As you can see, hearing from Jayme, it's encouraging, it's uplifting, but it's very eye-opening, and to be able to see how the mind processes. And so if you can share experiences of your own, that helps others who listen to our show and read these comments. Please give this episode a like. Right down there, just hit that like button, subscribe to this podcast, and then share this episode with someone who you think might need to hear it. And remember, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mind Matters.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.